Marcus had spent the better part of his 20s chasing approval from his parents who never seemed satisfied with his achievements. Chasing romantic partners who treated his devotion as something expected rather than cherished. Chasing career opportunities that promised fulfillment but delivered only empty recognition. Chasing friendships with people who took his generosity for granted and disappeared when he needed support in return. He was a man perpetually in motion, yet somehow always standing still. The revelation came not in a moment of triumph, but in a moment of profound defeat. After his latest relationship ended with the familiar refrain of "You're too available, too predictable," Marcus found himself alone in his apartment on a Friday night, staring at his phone, finger hovering over her contact. The urge to text, to explain, to convince, to chase one more time was overwhelming. But something deep within him rebelled against this familiar pattern. For the first time in years, Marcus put the phone down and asked himself a question that would change everything. What if I stopped running toward what doesn't want me and started walking toward what I actually am? This question marked the beginning of what ancient philosophers called the great work, the deliberate destruction and reconstruction of the self. Marcus didn't know it then, but he was about to embark on the most challenging and rewarding journey of his life, the journey from weakness to power, from chasing to being chased, from being ordinary to becoming the prize. The concept of becoming the prize is not about arrogance or superiority. It's about recognizing and cultivating your inherent value until it becomes so undeniable that others naturally gravitate toward you. It's about shifting from a mindset of scarcity, where you believe good things are rare and must be desperately pursued, to a mindset of abundance, where you understand that by becoming your best self, you attract the best that life has to offer. Marcus's transformation began with a painful but necessary inventory of his weaknesses. He realized that his constant chasing stemmed from a deep-seated belief that he wasn't enough as he was. This belief manifested in countless ways, saying yes to every social invitation even when he was exhausted, agreeing with opinions he didn't share to avoid conflict, working overtime not because he loved his job but because he feared being seen as inadequate, and, in relationships, giving more than he received while telling himself this was simply what love looked like. The modern world, Marcus realized, was designed to keep people in a state of perpetual want. Social media showed him curated highlights of others' lives, making his own seem inadequate by comparison. Advertising told him he needed the next product, the next experience, the next achievement to be complete. Dating culture had become a marketplace where everyone was simultaneously selling themselves and shopping for something better. In this environment, the person who chases appears weak, while the person who doesn't need to chase appears strong. But strength, Marcus learned, isn't about playing games or manipulating others. True strength comes from self-knowledge and self-acceptance so complete that external validation becomes unnecessary rather than unavailable. When you know your worth, you don't need others to confirm it. When you're comfortable with yourself, you don't need constant companionship. When you have clear boundaries and standards, you don't accept treatment that diminishes you. The first phase of Marcus's transformation involved what he came to call the Great Withdrawal. This wasn't about becoming antisocial or bitter, but about stepping back from the endless cycle of giving, chasing, and seeking approval long enough to remember who he was beneath all the people-pleasing and performance. He began saying no to social obligations that drained him, choosing instead to spend time alone reading, thinking, and pursuing interests he had abandoned in his quest to be everything to everyone. He stopped checking his ex-girlfriend's social media, deleted dating apps that made him feel like he was window shopping for love, and began treating his time and attention as valuable resources that required conscious allocation. This withdrawal period was difficult. Friends who were accustomed to his constant availability expressed confusion and sometimes annoyance when he wasn't immediately responsive. Family members who had grown comfortable with his automatic agreement to their requests had to adjust to his newfound selectivity. But something remarkable began to happen. As Marcus became less available, he became more interesting to others. As he stopped chasing, people began to wonder what he was doing instead. The psychology behind this phenomenon is well documented. Scarcity creates value, while abundance diminishes it. When something or someone is always available, we take it for granted. When that same thing or person becomes selective about their availability, our perception of their value increases. This isn't manipulation, it's a natural human response rooted in our evolutionary psychology. During his withdrawal, Marcus also began the crucial work of identifying and dismantling his weak self. He realized that the weak self wasn't his enemy to be hated, but rather a collection of survival strategies that had outlived their usefulness. His people-pleasing had protected him from conflict as a child but was now preventing him from having authentic relationships. His constant availability had made him feel needed but was actually making him less valued. His willingness to accept poor treatment had kept him in relationships but had prevented him from finding healthy ones. The weak self, Marcus understood, was like emotional scar tissue. It had formed to protect wounds, but now it was limiting his range of motion. The process of destroying this weak self wasn't about becoming harsh or uncaring, but about removing the barriers that prevented his authentic self from emerging. As weeks turned to months, Marcus noticed subtle but profound changes. His posture improved as he stopped carrying the weight of others' expectations. His speech became more direct as he stopped filtering everything through the lens of potential approval or disapproval. His decision-making became faster and more confident as he learned to trust his instincts rather than constantly seeking external validation. More importantly, he began to experience something he had forgotten existed: genuine self-respect. This wasn't the hollow confidence that comes from achievements or others' opinions, but the quiet strength that comes from living in alignment with your values and treating yourself with the same respect you would demand others show you. The transformation wasn't linear. There were days when Marcus fell back into old patterns, when the urge to chase, to please, to accommodate was overwhelming. But each time he resisted these urges, the weak self lost a little more power over him. Like a muscle that grows stronger with resistance training, his authentic self grew stronger each time he chose his own path over the path of least resistance. Friends began to comment that there was something different about him, though they couldn't quite articulate what it was. Women who had previously seen him as a friend began showing romantic interest. Colleagues started coming to him for advice and including him in opportunities they had never considered him for before. His family, initially resistant to his new boundaries, began to treat him with more respect. These external changes were gratifying, but they were also dangerous. Marcus realized that if he began to pursue these new opportunities with the same desperate energy he had brought to his previous chasing, he would simply recreate the same dynamic at a higher level. The goal wasn't to become someone who was chased instead of someone who chases, it was to become someone who didn't need to engage in the chase at all. This realization led to the second phase of his transformation, learning to receive attention and opportunities from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. When someone expressed interest in him, he didn't immediately assume it was his only chance and, therefore, something to be grasped desperately. Instead, he evaluated whether this person or opportunity aligned with what he actually wanted, not just what he thought he could get. The power of this shift cannot be overstated. When you chase, you communicate that you believe the other person or opportunity is more valuable than you are. When you evaluate from a place of abundance, you communicate that you recognize your own value and expect others to recognize it as well. This doesn't make you arrogant, it makes you selective, and selectivity is attractive because it implies that being chosen by you means something. Marcus began to understand that becoming the prize wasn't about making himself more appealing to others, it was about becoming more appealing to himself. When you genuinely like who you are, others are naturally drawn to that self-acceptance. When you have clear standards and boundaries, others respect them. When you're not afraid to be alone, others want to be part of your solitude. The man who had once checked his phone dozens of times a day hoping for messages from people who barely thought of him now found his phone full of messages from people eager for his time and attention. The difference wasn't in his external circumstances, it was in his internal state. He had stopped radiating need and started radiating strength. As the first phase of his transformation concluded, Marcus realized that destroying his weak self hadn't made him invulnerable to others, it had made him invulnerable to his own weaknesses. And, a man who cannot be destroyed by his own weaknesses, he was beginning to understand, truly cannot be destroyed by others. Part 2, The Architecture of Strength, Building an Unshakable Foundation. The second phase of Marcus's journey began with a startling realization: most of what he had considered his personality was actually just a collection of reactions to other people's expectations and behaviors. His humor was designed to diffuse tension and gain approval. His generosity was motivated by a fear of being seen as selfish. His agreeableness was a strategy to avoid conflict. Strip away these reactive patterns, and what remained? This question terrified him at first. If he wasn't the accommodating, always available, eager to please version of himself, then who was he? The answer, he discovered, could only be found in solitude and honest self-examination. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus began to spend significant time alone, not the desperate, phone-scrolling, distraction-seeking alone time he had previously endured, but intentional, reflective solitude. During these hours of quiet contemplation, Marcus began to distinguish between his authentic preferences and his conditioned responses. He realized he actually preferred smaller gatherings to large parties, deeper conversations to small talk, and focused work to multitasking, preferences he had suppressed because they seemed to make him less popular or productive in conventional terms. This process of self-discovery wasn't pleasant. Marcus encountered aspects of himself he had long denied: his capacity for anger when his boundaries were violated, his intolerance for dishonesty, his high standards for how he expected to be treated. These weren't flaws to be hidden but strengths to be integrated. The weak self had taught him to suppress these qualities because they might make others uncomfortable, but the strong self recognized them as necessary components of self-respect. The architecture of true strength, Marcus learned, isn't built on the shifting sands of others' opinions but on the bedrock of self-knowledge and self-acceptance. This foundation requires several key elements, each of which he had to develop deliberately and maintain consistently. First was the development of internal validation systems. The weak self had outsourced all judgment about his worth to others, making him perpetually vulnerable to their changing moods and opinions. The strong self learned to evaluate his actions and decisions against his own values and standards. This didn't mean becoming deaf to feedback or criticism, but it meant weighing external input against internal wisdom rather than automatically accepting it as truth. Marcus began keeping what he called a reality journal, a daily practice of writing down his honest thoughts and feelings about his experiences without filtering them through what others might think. This practice helped him identify patterns in his thinking and behavior, recognize when he was acting from strength versus weakness, and celebrate progress that others might not even notice. The second element was the cultivation of genuine interests and passions independent of social approval. Marcus had to honestly confront how many of his activities were chosen based on what others would think rather than what genuinely interested him. He discovered a love for philosophy that led to late-night reading sessions that energized rather than exhausted him. He began learning guitar not to impress anyone but because music had always moved him in ways he had never explored. He started cooking elaborate meals for himself, treating his own nourishment with the same care he had once reserved for impressing others. These pursuits served multiple functions in his transformation. They gave him genuine confidence based on developing real skills and knowledge. They provided topics of conversation that came from authentic passion rather than scripted small talk. Most importantly, they filled his time with activities that he enjoyed regardless of whether anyone else was there to witness or approve of them. The third element was the establishment of non-negotiable boundaries and standards. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect of his transformation because it required him to risk disappointing or losing people he cared about. Marcus had to learn to say no not just to obviously unreasonable requests, but to reasonable requests that didn't align with his priorities or values. He stopped lending money to friends who had never repaid previous loans, not because he couldn't afford it but because he realized that enabling irresponsible behavior wasn't actually helping them. He began declining social invitations when he was tired or had other priorities, despite the guilt-tripping and accusations of being antisocial that sometimes followed. He started expressing disagreement with opinions that conflicted with his values, even when agreement would have been easier. Each boundary he established was initially met with resistance from people who had benefited from his previous lack of boundaries. Some friends accused him of becoming selfish or arrogant. Family members complained that he had changed and wasn't as accommodating as he used to be. Former romantic interests who had taken his availability for granted suddenly wanted to reconnect when they sensed his unavailability. But Marcus had learned a crucial lesson: the people who were upset by his boundaries were often the people who had been benefiting from their absence. Those who truly cared about him as a person rather than what he could do for them adjusted to his new standards and often expressed respect for his newfound self-respect. The fourth element was developing what philosophers call equanimity, the ability to remain centered and balanced regardless of external circumstances. This wasn't about becoming emotionally numb or detached, but about not allowing his inner peace to be dependent on external validation, success, or failure. Marcus practiced this through both meditation and deliberate exposure to situations that had previously triggered his need for approval. He would express unpopular opinions in group conversations and observe his emotional response. He would go to social events alone and notice any discomfort that arose from not having someone to validate his presence. He would receive compliments and criticism with equal composure, neither inflating his ego nor deflating his self-worth. This practice of equanimity extended to his relationship with outcomes. The weak self had been attached to specific results: getting the girl, landing the promotion, being liked by everyone. The strong self learned to focus on the process rather than the outcome, to find satisfaction in acting according to his values regardless of whether others recognized or rewarded those actions. As Marcus developed these elements of strength, he began to notice that his entire relationship with power had shifted. Previously, he had seen power as something others had and he lacked, something to be gained through achievement, accumulation, or approval. Now he recognized power as something inherent, the power to choose his responses, to set his standards, to determine his own worth. This shift was perhaps most evident in his professional life. Where he had once accepted projects and responsibilities that drained him because he feared being seen as unambitious, he now evaluated opportunities based on whether they aligned with his goals and values. He began negotiating more aggressively for compensation and conditions that reflected his worth. He stopped staying late to fix problems that weren't his responsibility, not because he didn't care about his work but because he recognized that consistently rescuing others from their poor planning was enabling dysfunction rather than helping. The results were remarkable. His colleagues began to see him as more competent and valuable, not because he was working harder but because he was working more strategically. His managers started coming to him for input on important decisions, recognizing something in his demeanor that suggested depth and reliability. Opportunities that he had previously chased began presenting themselves to him. In his personal relationships, the transformation was even more dramatic. Friends who had previously treated him as an emotional dumping ground began asking for his advice and input on important decisions. Women who had once seen him as a safe, non-threatening friend began responding to him with genuine romantic interest. His family, initially resistant to his new boundaries, began including him in decisions and conversations they had previously excluded him from. But perhaps the most significant change was in his relationship with solitude. Where being alone had once felt like punishment, evidence that he wasn't interesting or valuable enough to attract company, it now felt like a luxury. He genuinely enjoyed his own company, found his own thoughts interesting, and was content with his own presence. This shift was crucial because it meant that he no longer needed others to validate his existence or fill his time. When you're genuinely comfortable being alone, others can sense that their presence in your life is a choice rather than a necessity. This makes you inherently more attractive because people want to be chosen rather than needed. Need is burdensome, choice is flattering. When someone feels that you would be perfectly fine without them, they're more motivated to give you reasons to want them around. Marcus began to understand that the strongest position in any relationship, romantic, professional, or otherwise, is the position of the person who would be okay if the relationship ended. This doesn't mean being indifferent or cold, but it means having a strong enough foundation of self-worth and life satisfaction that you don't need any particular relationship to feel complete. This principle extended beyond individual relationships to his approach to life in general. He stopped making decisions based on fear of missing out or fear of being left behind. Instead, he made choices based on what genuinely aligned with his values and goals, trusting that the right opportunities and people would be attracted to his authentic self. The man who had once anxiously refreshed dating apps and social media feeds now found himself genuinely too busy and fulfilled to need constant digital validation. His phone became a tool rather than a lifeline, checking it when convenient rather than compulsively. This shift in his relationship with technology was both a symptom and a cause of his growing strength. As he needed external validation less, he sought it less, which made him need it even less. As the second phase of his transformation neared completion, Marcus realized that building strength wasn't about becoming invulnerable to all harm or criticism. Rather, it was about developing such a solid foundation of self-knowledge, self-respect, and genuine confidence that external attacks couldn't shake his core sense of worth. Like a tree with deep roots, he could bend with strong winds without breaking, and return to his natural position once the storm passed. The man who had once been destroyed by a single criticism or rejection now could receive feedback, evaluate its validity, and either integrate useful insights or dismiss unfair attacks without his fundamental sense of self being threatened. He had become, in the truest sense, unshakable, not because nothing could move him, but because he always returned to center. Part 3, The Crown of Mastery, Living as the Prize. The third and final phase of Marcus's transformation began with a paradox. The moment he stopped trying to become the prize, he became it. This wasn't a conscious decision or strategic shift, but a natural evolution of the work he had done in the previous phases. Having destroyed his weak self and built an unshakable foundation of strength, he now found himself in the position he had once desperately sought, not through chasing or manipulation, but through authentic self-development. The change was subtle but unmistakable. People began seeking his company not because he was entertaining or accommodating, but because there was something compelling about his presence. Conversations with him felt more substantial, his opinions carried weight, and his attention felt valuable because it wasn't freely given to everyone. He had achieved what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, not happiness in the modern sense of feeling good, but the deeper satisfaction that comes from living according to one's highest potential. Living as the prize, Marcus discovered, wasn't about believing himself superior to others, but about recognizing and embodying his own unique value so completely that it became undeniable to everyone around him. This required a fundamental shift in how he approached every interaction and decision in his life. In romantic relationships, this transformation was most apparent. Where he had once approached dating from a position of scarcity, grateful for any interest and terrified of losing it, he now approached it from abundance. When meeting someone new, instead of wondering, "Do they like me?" he found himself asking, "Do I like them?" This wasn't arrogance, it was the natural result of having a clear sense of his own worth and what he was looking for in a partner. The woman who would eventually become his wife later told him that what initially attracted her was not any specific thing he said or did, but the way he carried himself. He seemed genuinely content with his life, genuinely interested in her as a person rather than as a validation of his worth, and genuinely unafraid of whether she chose to continue seeing him or not. This absence of neediness created space for genuine connection to develop naturally. Marcus learned that when you're the prize, you don't need to convince anyone of your value is evident in how you treat yourself and others. You don't need to play hard to get because you genuinely have a full life that can't be easily disrupted by someone else's presence or absence. You don't need to create artificial scarcity because your time and attention are naturally limited by your commitments to your own growth and goals. This principle extended far beyond romantic relationships. In his professional life, Marcus found that opportunities came to him not because he was the most qualified candidate, but because he presented himself as someone whose association would be valuable. He spoke with confidence about his abilities without arrogance, set clear expectations about compensation and working conditions, and was willing to walk away from opportunities that didn't meet his standards. The key insight was that being the prize isn't about what you have or what you've achieved, it's about how you carry yourself and how you treat your own time, energy, and attention. A person with modest external accomplishments can be the prize if they have genuine self-respect and clear boundaries. Conversely, someone with impressive achievements can fail to be the prize if they're desperate for validation or willing to accept poor treatment. Marcus developed what he called the prize mindset, a way of approaching life that assumed his participation in any situation was valuable and that others should demonstrate why they deserved that participation. This wasn't about being difficult or demanding, but about having standards and expecting them to be met. In practical terms, this meant he stopped accepting last-minute invitations unless they were truly appealing to him. He stopped saying yes to requests for his time without considering whether they aligned with his priorities. He stopped engaging with people who were consistently negative, unreliable, or disrespectful, regardless of the history he shared with them. These changes were initially met with surprise and, sometimes resistance from people accustomed to his previous availability. But Marcus had learned that people's initial reaction to your boundaries is often the opposite of their long-term response. Those who were upset by his new standards usually adjusted and began treating him with more respect, while those who couldn't adjust revealed themselves as people who had been taking advantage of his previous lack of boundaries. The prize mindset also required him to develop what he called outcome independence, the ability to take action and make decisions based on his values and goals rather than his attachment to specific results. This was perhaps the most liberating aspect of his transformation. When you're not attached to outcomes, you can take risks, express yourself authentically, and pursue opportunities without the fear and desperation that repel others. In conversations, this manifested as a willingness to express unpopular opinions, disagree when appropriate, and end interactions that weren't serving him, even if the other person wanted to continue. In relationships, it meant being fully present and engaged while simultaneously being prepared to walk away if his standards weren't met. In his career, it meant pursuing opportunities he was genuinely excited about rather than just opportunities that seemed safe or likely to lead to approval. This outcome independence created a powerful feedback loop. Because he wasn't desperately attached to any particular result, he could take actions that were more likely to produce positive results. Because he wasn't afraid of rejection, he could be more authentic, which made him more attractive. Because he wasn't afraid of being alone, he could be more selective in his relationships, which led to better relationships. Marcus also discovered that living as the prize required constant vigilance against the tendency to slip back into old patterns. The weak self, while largely defeated, would occasionally resurface during times of stress, loneliness, or uncertainty. The key was recognizing these moments and consciously choosing to respond from strength rather than weakness. This was particularly challenging during periods when life presented genuine difficulties, job loss, health problems, family crises, or relationship challenges. These situations naturally triggered old insecurities and the temptation to seek external validation or acceptance at any cost. But Marcus learned that these were precisely the moments when maintaining his standards and boundaries was most crucial. During a particularly challenging period when he was between jobs, Marcus resisted the urge to accept a position that paid well but would have required him to compromise his values and work in a toxic environment. Friends and family questioned this decision, arguing that he was being too picky given his circumstances. But Marcus had learned that accepting situations that diminished him, even temporarily, always cost more in the long run than the short-term benefit they provided. Instead, he used the time to further develop his skills, network with people in his field who shared his values, and pursue opportunities that aligned with his long-term goals. The period of uncertainty was uncomfortable, but it ultimately led to a position that was better than anything he could have found by compromising his standards. This experience reinforced a crucial lesson: living as the prize requires faith in your own value even when external circumstances seem to suggest otherwise. It means trusting that by maintaining your standards and continuing to develop yourself, the right opportunities will eventually present themselves. This isn't naive optimism but a realistic assessment that people and opportunities of quality are attracted to others who demonstrate self-respect and refuse to settle for less than they deserve. Living as the prize also meant developing what Marcus called generous boundaries, the ability to be selective about where he invested his time and energy while being genuinely generous with those who earned and appreciated that investment. This wasn't about being cold or calculating, but about recognizing that his capacity for giving was finite and therefore should be directed toward people and causes that truly valued and reciprocated it. With friends who respected his boundaries and treated him well, Marcus was more generous than he had ever been when he was trying to be everything to everyone. With romantic partners who demonstrated genuine care and commitment, he was more loving and supportive than when he was afraid of losing anyone who showed interest. With colleagues who valued his contributions and treated him fairly, he was more collaborative and helpful than when he was desperately seeking approval from everyone. The paradox of the prize mentality is that by becoming more selective, you become more valuable to those you choose to invest in. By having higher standards, you attract people who can meet those standards. By being less available, you make your availability more meaningful when you do choose to give it. As Marcus's transformation reached its full expression, he realized that the journey from weakness to strength, from chasing to being the prize, wasn't a destination but an ongoing practice. The man who destroys his weak self must continue to guard against its return. The man who becomes the prize must continue to act in ways that maintain and deserve that status. But, unlike the exhausting effort required to maintain a false persona or chase external validation, living as the prize became increasingly effortless. When your actions align with your values, when your boundaries protect rather than isolate you, and when your sense of worth comes from within rather than without, life becomes an expression of strength rather than a struggle against weakness. The man who had once measured his worth by others' opinions now found that others measured their worth partly by his opinion of them. The man who had once desperately sought inclusion now had people competing for his attention. The man who had once feared being alone now cherished his solitude and shared it only with those who enhanced rather than disrupted it. But, perhaps most importantly, Marcus had learned that true power isn't the ability to control others, but the ability to control yourself. The man who can choose his responses rather than being enslaved by his reactions, who can set standards and maintain them regardless of external pressure, who can find satisfaction in his own growth and achievements regardless of others' recognition, this man truly cannot be destroyed by others because he has already conquered the only enemy that could truly defeat him, his own weakness. The philosophy of becoming the prize, Marcus understood in the end, isn't about winning a competition with others but about winning the most important competition of all, the one with your former, weaker self. When you've won that battle, all other victories become not just possible but inevitable, because you've developed the strength of character that attracts success rather than chasing it. In this final phase of his transformation, Marcus had achieved something that seemed impossible when his journey began. He had become genuinely attractive not through manipulation or performance, but through the simple act of becoming someone he genuinely respected and enjoyed being. And, in doing so, he had discovered the ultimate truth about power and attraction. The most magnetic force in the world is a person who likes themselves enough that they don't need anyone else to complete them, but chooses to share their completeness with others who deserve it. The man who had once been destroyed by a single rejection now stood unshakable in the face of any criticism. The man who had once chased every opportunity now had opportunities seeking him. The man who had once wondered if he would ever be enough had become someone others wondered if they were good enough for. This wasn't the end of his story but the beginning of a new chapter, one written not in desperation but in strength, not in need but in choice, not in weakness but in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing, beyond any doubt, that he had become the prize he had always had the potential to be. The transformation from weakness to strength, from chasing to being chased, from ordinary to prize, is available to anyone willing to do the deep work of self-examination, boundary setting, and authentic development. It requires destroying not who you are, but who you've been pretending to be in order to gain acceptance from people and situations that don't deserve you. The man who completes this work truly cannot be destroyed by others, because he has already destroyed everything in himself that was weak, false, and unworthy of respect. What remains is unshakable, valuable, and naturally attractive to everything good that life has to offer.